Hey Matt, I have a hankering for Warforged and world building some high adventure tonight.
Well, maybe we should have a chat with Keith Baker then.
That's how we roll. 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 Welcome to the Goblins Corner. My name is Eric.
And I'm Matt.
And tonight,
We're talking with Keith Baker.
that's right. Keith Baker is the creator and author of Eberron and has contributed tons of material to WotC, Goodman Games, Paizo, Green Ronin, and the DM's Guild, just to name a few places. Keith is also the co-founder of the tabletop game company Twogether Studios. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Keith, for the people who may be new to tabletop gaming, how did you get into creating and world building?
Well, I started playing D&D. I wouldn't say I started playing. I first acquired the white box and the hardcover AD&D books when I was around 7 or 8. And I just loved them. You know, to me, the Monster Manual was the coolest coloring book you ever did find. And I was probably around 10 or 11 when I actually ran my first game for people. But I just loved it from day one. I always, wanted to create my own worlds. And going from there, I always sort of knew someone wrote this book. Like, this is a job that exists. I don't know how you get it, but I'm going to figure it out. And that was pretty much, I was on a path and I just kept at it until I did.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's generally how we started games as well, right? Just get into D&D or get into one of those that hooks you.
I think the thing that I've always loved about it is when you read a book, when you watch a movie, you're a passive participant and you're sort of at the mercy of the author or the writer. And, if the story ends up going in a direction that you're like, that's dumb, why would anyone do that? Well, too bad. That's what it is. And I love, both as a game master and a player, the fact that when we do a role-playing game, it creates a story that's unique to us. I have an adventure that I've run at this point about 60 times. And it is still fun for me to run it because every time something will be different based on the players, who they are, or what they decide to do. And I just love that sort of, wild and collaborative experience.
Yeah, people's interactions change. And of course, different characters, different game, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So let's, interestingly enough, we talk a lot about world building on this show as well, and this is something you're quite familiar with also. We get a lot of questions from new storytellers, and in general, they want to try their hand at world building. Obviously, there are two different types, and you've got like the full top-down world building, and then the bottom up where you start small and expand. What would you say, like, if you had a starting DM? What would you recommend for them to start in the right direction, like a few tips and tricks?
So one of the things, if you're actually planning to create a world, the first question that does come up is, why are you creating a world? What is the story that you can't tell, either in an existing world or in our world? Because one of the things is, if you use our world, if you say, I'm going to set this in, Roman times, but I'm going to add magic to it, then even if you're changing it, everybody knows all the basics. I don't have to explain to you what the Roman Empire is. And now I'm not saying don't create a world, but I'm saying there is the point of, why are you creating a world? What's the story you can't tell in our world? And to me, I really try and suggest that figure out how you can describe this in 1 to 2 sentences. Like, what is the key thing about your world that's going to make me want to play in it? So with Eberron, it was Lord of the Rings meets Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Maltese Falcon. A world where magic is treated as a form of science. And again, you don't have to have like that perfect elevator pitch that you can say in 30 seconds, but it's still that question of what makes your world unlike the ones out there. What is the thing that both excites you and is going to excite me to play in it?
Gets people into the mood.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing is if you can't explain something simply, then you may not understand it well enough yourself.
Well, and again, just for the players,
right?
It's just that point of, can you give me the sense of why to be excited, what I can latch on to? Eberron is vast. There's like tons of different things on it, but starting with that basic point of, it's got some pulp and noir, it's got magic used as science. Then we can get into the Last War, into the dragon marked houses. All of these are things that we expand on, but we've still got that basic concept. What makes it different? The other thing I would, just to quickly highlight what you talked about, top down, ground up. Top down is the way to go when the world itself is the story. When it's something like Dragonlance, where the point is it is about the war against the dragons, and it's something that will take place across the world. Then you need to sort of have a sense of the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
But often it is easier to start from the ground up and just say, I'm going to pick one location. I'm going to pick the city of Sanctuary. I'm going to pick Waterdeep or Sharn. Because, again, you take a place like Eberron and you can run a whole campaign in Sharn.
Sure.
So the point is start with one place, really build that up and really get to know that. And then you can sort of say, well, we know there's the big empire to the south. We know that up north are the horse tribes. But I don't have to really get the specifics down on them too much until we actually leave the city. And we won't be doing that for a while.
And regardless of whether it's like a large concept or you start small, the reason these games work is because of the characters. And so that's one of those things where it's like, if your characters mesh, if they have a backstory, at least in their heads, even if they don't have one for you, then it makes more sense. The game is more full because it's collaborative. And that's the thing.
Right. And this is a big thing when you're making a setting for you and your friends. When you're making something for publication, that's, sort of another story. But when you're the DM and you're going to run a campaign for your friends and you're making a new world, the first thing I would say is involve your friends. Basically try and find ways to let them sort of feel a connection to a piece of the world. So if you have the player who always plays dwarf barbarians and he's going to play a dwarf barbarian, talk to them about what do you think the dwarves are like in this world? Like, what's the catch to the dwarves? Or, basically something like that. Ideally, you have friends who are creative and you don't hate all of their ideas. But it's still the point that you don't have to do all the work yourself. And that the more you do allow the players to have some sense of development in it, the more they're going to care about the world. And the more they're going to feel a deep attachment to the story.
That was actually a piece of advice that I gave somebody not too long ago. Was if you're starting off as like a small starting town and expanding for them or planning for them to expand outward, let them invent like a handful of NPCs and a handful of bars.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Don't tell them where they're going to be.
Oh, yeah.
And that way, when they come across their own creations live in time with the world, it's just a pleasant surprise.
I have to say, I love that idea of create a bunch of bars and they're scattered across the world and you'll stumble into them. That is fantastic. What I have done is, I have a campaign I've run a couple different versions of in Eberron that's a Western campaign. And the point is it starts in a small mining town. And for much of the early campaign, it stays in the small mining town. It's sort of Deadwood with trolls, And part of what I always do there is when I have the group of players, I have the basic structure of it, but I'll say, tell me an NPC in town that your character has a connection to. Or in particular, I didn't have them name different bars, but I said, there's one bar. It's the Crooked Cat. Each of you tell me something about it. And
cool.
It was funny. I remember with the one group going around the table, and the one guy's like, they have an open mic night, on Wednesdays. I'm like, great. They've got good acoustics. Wonderful. One guy's like, oh, they make the best biscuits in town. We're like, great. Other guy's like, they brew beer in the basement. Got it. Final guy says, they don't have a toilet and it smells terrible. And everyone was just like, why? Why did you do that to our beautiful fun bar? And so the first 3 adventures were all about the group trying to raise enough money to get a magic, sewage system
Nice.
for this bar.
This is a great idea because as an improviser, improvisation in a role-playing game is pretty much key, particularly when people kind of throw you like, a curveball or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
When a lot of DMs start out, they want to write out the entire scenario, and then the first thing that happens is their players don't do the scenario they wrote. How much of an emphasis do you place on improvising versus having a written story?
So I improvise all the time. as I said, that's how you get the adventure that I've run 60 times and it's never the same. It's because a lot of times I'm expecting the players to come up with answers I haven't thought about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the key is what I do is instead of trying to script an entire path, I try and script key scenes, key NPCs, and choke points. So in the case of that adventure I'm talking about, the adventurers arrive in town trying to find a wizard who's trying to transfer their mind into another body. And they know they've got 24 hours to find this guy. If he transfers his mind, they'll never find him. And the question is, how are you going to find him? And the thing is, I know a bunch of, they could look for the person supplying supplies for rituals. They could look for the other people he'd have to work with to do this ritual. They could come up with ways to get people to recognize him. So I know a couple. I can deal with if they come up with something I didn't expect, but I also know any of these points will ultimately lead them to his hotel room.
Sure.
And then I've got a scene planned in his hotel room. Like, I don't know how they're going to get there exactly, but I know they will. And that's the big thing I've put a lot of emphasis into planning. And then I know from there, they'll get the clues, which again, we've got this fuzzy bit in the middle, but I know eventually they'll get to the hideout where, he is. And that's where I put the things.
Yeah.
So I can be flexible. Like I said, I've over the time, I've really built up that magic item merchant who I love. But if the players come up with a better solution I hadn't thought of that circumvents that, still going to get them to the hotel. I still have a path. I just have a very flexible way of getting, of allowing them to get there.
It's like the scene in old adventure movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark and stuff where there's the dotted line travel path. Really, only the points are what mattered. The dotted line, no matter how it squirrels around,
exactly right,
still gets them where it's going eventually.
Yeah. And like I say, having run this adventure 60 times, I have a bunch of pretty well-developed NPCs that they might go to, but it doesn't bother me if they never go to the magic item vendor because, they come up with a different idea. But as I say, there's enough factors, among other things, just by putting a time limit. You got 24 hours, which means they can't just decide we're going to start a business and, do something completely crazy, which players will try and do.
So this brings up an interesting point, too, is because you've got these plot points, you've got choke points, you have kind of like a bullet point list of things that could potentially happen, which is kind of how a lot of DMs play. Consequence of actions in your campaign. You've got a lot of moving parts, particularly Eberron, because Eberron's got political intrigue, it's got magical factions. You've got, potential war, sometimes outright war, all kinds of stuff going on. How do you juggle that stuff?
So part of it is narrowing it down and deciding what actually is going to matter in this campaign. So Eberron has so much stuff that I don't try and use it all. I always tell people that Eberron has a number of sort of major low-level villains and major high-level villains. You've got the Lords of Dust, Dalkir, the Dreaming Dark. Like all three of those are major sort of world-shaking villains. And my thing is I'm like, pick one. Like pick the one who's the big bad for this season. And if you go through the whole campaign and get done, bring in the other. Or, have some of the others as sort of minor plots. We deal with the Cult of the Dragon below, but we're never actually, the Dalkir are not a big threat here. So part of it is sort of narrow down the toys in the toolbox, figure out what you actually want this game to be about. The other thing is tied to that. Part of it is decide that question again of, is this something that's taking us across the entire world? Is it Raiders of the Lost Ark, where I'm going to be picking my points, saying we're going to start in Sharn, but we're going to have a cool scene in Korth. We're going to go to Stormreach next. We're going to do, and then I'm thinking about those locations and what each has to offer.
Mm-hmm.
Or am I focusing on something like the Hope adventure I told you about, where it's the mining town, where there I'm really narrowing my scope, but making it that the House Tharash, guy who owns the mines is like a huge villain in this story because like he's the richest man in town and he's trying to buy out all the miners, and it's a totally different kind of story, but it means the stakes, the things that players can sort of they can step into, if you'll pardon my saying, or the trouble they can get into is dramatically different than that traveling campaign where they're going to be messing around with, dragons and conspiracies and dragon marked houses and things like that.
There's a serious difference between an epic campaign and a personal campaign.
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah.
You like that first one, you make it personal, and then that top level view going back to like with all the moving parts and stuff, that's more of like the epic campaign, right?
Right.
Right. And one of the questions is, what do the players have to lose? And in the epic campaign, in the Dragonlance, it could be that what the players have to lose is literally the world, or their civilization, or their country. When you're playing the smaller campaign, it's no, what you have to lose is your sister,
right,
or the toilet at the bar. And you can invest more in those sort of small scale things because the whole thing is on a smaller scale. Whereas again, like I said, if you're playing on that wider scale, you can say, oh, we lost Sharn.
Yeah.
And, that's a whole different kind of story. Part of the thing I do say is, and this is part of what I suggest doing in a session 0, is to think of this as essentially, what's the genre you're playing? If this was a movie, is it a war movie? Is it just action? Is it funny? Because again, that helps give your players a sense of what to expect. Are we talking about, Lord of the Rings, or are we talking about Brendan Fraser and The Mummy? Because those are very different in their tone.
And what your players are comfortable with, too. I mean, that's the whole reason Session Zeros exists. It's like, what do you guys want to play? Because it's not just the DM coming up with stuff. It's you guys are building this world, too. You're building this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something I think is very interesting when you look at the preview for the latest Dungeons & Dragons movie. It's the previous Dungeons & Dragons movies had been more in that epic fantasy Lord of the Rings, and this one looks more like Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Like they're basically saying we're going to be more of kind of a, fairly funny, heist type story.
It's more of a home game than an adventure league.
I actually may care about the characters in this upcoming movie as opposed to the previous ones.
Yeah, I'm quite eager to see what they do with it. But I think part of it is exactly that. It's they're willing to say you can have more than one kind of D&D movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's also what makes Critical Role so interesting too, is because they personalize all of the characters.
Whereas by contrast, Phoenix Dawn Command, the role-playing game I made with Twogether Studios, my company, part of the point from that is we stay right from the start. This is basically a supernatural war movie. That, the concept is essentially Lord of the Rings meets World War Z. That this is a fantasy world, but it's a world that is facing an existential threat that we don't really understand. And you're the only people who can try and fight it. And so from the start, one of the questions is essentially Phoenix starts with you die, because as a Phoenix, you are someone who comes back to life imbued with supernatural power. And what we basically say is, well, how'd you die? And why'd you come back? Like, what are you fighting for? Like, that this is the story. The story is you are coming back to spend the rest of the lives you have fighting to protect the world from these threats. Why? What is it that you care about? Because that's the story we're dealing with.
And it's got some guardrails, basically, is what you're saying. And then they can tailor it.
And what I'm saying is, as the game master, I am not taking full responsibility for making you interested in the story. I want you to tell me why you're interested in the story.
Right.
Make a character who cares and figure out why that is. Because the story is Saving Private Ryan. So I'm saying, why are you on that beach?
Sure. And that's a great, that's a mechanical version of the questionnaire for Session 0 for D&D, right?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of the things we were talking about was how a campaign is basically a genre in and of itself.
Yeah, it's true.
Now, Eberron is kind of pulpy, kind of steampunk, and it's got a blend of different styles. Is there a style of game or setting that you haven't gotten a chance to tackle yet? Or is there any type of style or genre where you're just like, I have no interest in that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, Eberron in particular, the point is Eberron is very much top down and very much designed to tell many different types of stories. So it embraces pulp adventure and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, high action, but you can also have like a more gritty Streets of Sharn, detective story that never even leaves Sharn, like I said, or like I've been running, the Western story, which is completely different from both of those. And so there's a lot of room to choose. And so, I've actually seen, again, I'm thinking about the things I haven't run, because, I have run, I've run horror. I've run sort of Gangs of New York, Mean Streets. I've run classic Raiders of the Lost Ark, Globetrotting. One of the ones I've wanted to do in Eberron that I've never actually done is Supernatural War Story. And that is in Eberron. There is particularly a point in history where the Church of the Silver Flame sought to basically wipe out lycanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
That lycanthropy was perceived at the time as a sort of zombie apocalypse level threat. There was this surge of lycanthropy that was threatening to overrun the world. And you basically had the Templars of the Silver Flame going to this vast, endless forest and fighting, lycanthropes and having conflict and confusion with the Druids and Rangers and such that also lived in the same forest and were easily mistaken. And so sort of a Vietnam War meets, World War Z zombie apocalypse in the jungle. And I've always wanted to sort of run a campaign that is like basically Templars and Shifters, like having to join forces and work together to deal with this, threat of hidden werewolves and such. So sort of this combination of war movie and the classic werewolf, mystery, suspense.
They mostly come out at night, mostly.
Mostly. I love Aliens. Aliens is definitely one of my favorites. So
I would love to see something like a Church of the Silver Flame, like cleric or paladin. Maybe he's got his leg chopped off, like play a character like that where he's got some kind of PTSD.
Well, and this is the point to me of the, since you brought up the Aliens quote, this is the reason I want to run this campaign, is because to me that's the mood. Like, people often look at Eberron at that particular point in history and see it as, oh, those poor lycanthropes being hunted down by the Templars. And I'm like, no. Like, that was a brutal, like, the Templars were not at the beginning of that the Force was not on their side.
Right.
It should have been a terrifying aliens-like experience. I will say that's part of what I like about Phoenix, which I mentioned before, is Phoenix, the whole premise is every time you die, you come back stronger, but you can only come back 7 times. So it's not without consequence. You also don't come back right away. So it's very much Gandalf on the bridge in Moriah. That it's you can sacrifice yourself, but, you're not coming back till the next movie. So you better make sure you've, got everyone on the right track. What I love about that is it means failure isn't the end of the story. And it means that the odds can be very high, that the players, it's not fair.
Right.
You've got to figure out, well, I can bring down the bridge, and that's how we're going to beat this Balrog, because we're not beating it in a fair fight. And so that lets us have the tension of a movie like Aliens, because the TPK is on the table.
Sure.
Because it's not the end of the story. It's not the end of our campaign. It's just, you're going to fail this mission, and we're going to lose Sharn or whatever happens. But that means the players know, that bad things can happen here. So can you beat the odds? And I love being able to play with that kind of tension, which in some ways is harder in a game like D&D, where I don't want a TPK. I don't want the story to get destroyed. And so it's fun being able to play with different systems that do allow you to tell completely different kinds of stories.
And probably gives you a little bit of strategy as well. If you know that you potentially could die, but you've got 7 reboots, then, you know what I mean? Like, if I were a player, like, well, I know I'm going to die, it's not as personal. You can still make it personal, but it would...
Oh, yeah. But it also is very interesting because it means the more power you get, the less reckless you want to be with it.
Sure.
When you're just starting off as essentially a first level character, if there, someone throws a grenade, you can throw yourself on it. Why not? I got 7 lives. By the time you get to your 6th life, you have a lot more power. You level up 6 times, but you've only got 1 more left.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you want to be a lot more careful and try to use the power that you have gained, sort of more strategically, instead of just saying, what do I care? I'll be back.
Right.
So it's a totally different kind of story. The other thing about it is that essentially your class, what we call school, the lessons you learn when you come back are based on the reasons for your death and what you've taken away from it. So did you die for duty? Did you die because you weren't tough enough? Did you die for others? Did you sacrifice yourself to protect others? Those all sort of change, sort of against essentially the devoted is kind of our cleric. And the point is you sacrifice yourself for others. That's a devoted death. You're, gaining those sorts of powers as opposed to the durant who dies because they weren't tough enough and becomes tougher. And so it is very interesting in Phoenix that by the time you are 5 lives into the game, as it were, the abilities of your character very much reflect the choices you've made, the sacrifices you've made. So it's a very interesting, sort of just the way it all plays out.
It sounds a lot like a character evolution too.
Mm-hmm.
As you do like the rebirth, like because you learn more, you evolve more in your abilities and powers and stuff like that. That's really interesting.
And it's very interesting because there's 2 ways to go about it as well. Is you can just play it straight out and see what happens. Or if you're a very tactical, like I'm a man with a plan type of person, you can try and make sure you die the type of death you want to die.
I was just thinking that.
If you want to die sacrificing yourself for others because you want to be devoted, I'm trying to go full devoted. Well, just make sure
just keep jumping on the grenade,
those
man.
Opportunities, exactly.
See you in 20 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love the concept that how you die determines your progression. And seeing someone like from a classical D&D standpoint, right? Take a wizard trying to die the same type of death every time. And the wizard's like, nope, I need to know more. What do I got to do?
And in Phoenix, the class that our school, it's called Shrouded. That's kind of a cross between wizard and rogue. And their thing is they die because either in the pursuit of knowledge or because of secrets. And so, yeah, if you're always seeking knowledge, that's the Shrouded path.
Don't go down that door. That's where my head exploded.
Exactly.
Well, now I got to know why.
Yeah. I love the evolving idea of characters and stuff like that. And, one of the things we were thinking about earlier before the show was how Eberron has consistently evolved as people add stories, not just, from the books that you've written, but also, DM Skill's popping out stuff. You got some stuff in DM Skill as well. What are your thoughts on the evolution of kind of your baby, your game world?
So it's interesting because, it is that thing of I created it, but then over the course, it's been 20 years now. And, a lot of different authors, I didn't work on all the books. And now on the DMs Guild, all sorts of people are making stuff for it. Personally, I think it's fantastic. One of the things is that Eberron was not a world I played in before I made it for Wizards. So it's not like Ed Greenwood, where Forgotten Realms was his campaign world for years before he ended up passing it along. Eberron was something I developed for the Fantasy Setting Search and passed to Wizards. So I don't have that. I do now. It is like, especially the novels. It's hard for me reading the novels because whenever I read novels that aren't mine, I'm always like, oh no, that's not how I see that. And it's not that it's bad.
Right.
It's just that I'm like, no, that's not what that guy's like. But in terms of the world, like I said, it's a grander version of the fact that what I love is collaboration. I love that the story comes out differently than I expected. Part of the thing that also makes it easy for me to not worry about what people do with Eberron is from the very beginning, we pushed a approach to it, which is to say that canon lore is a place to begin. It's not something that should hold you back. The biggest example of this is the Mourning. In Eberron, there was a huge civil war. The war came to an end when one of the 5 nations fighting was completely destroyed in a magical cataclysm called the Mourning. And the point is that happened 4 years ago, and no one knows what caused it. And when I say no one, I mean no one. We don't tell you what caused it.
Right.
We give suggestions. It could be X, it could be Y. But the point is, if I play in your Eberron campaign, I don't know what caused the Mourning. And that same premise is sort of where it goes all over. And this really comes back to when I was 8. I would pick up adventures that, Vault of the Drow, Against the Giants, but I'd always change them and make them, my own. And we want you to do that with Eberron. We're saying, take what works for you, use it as a foundation. But if there's something that you would like, the big one's firearms. I don't have guns in my Eberron. You really want gunslingers in your Eberron? Go for it. I'm not going to come there and rip it out of your world. So to me, it's all about that, giving people a foundation and giving them something to work with. But I love people making it their own and making their own stories with it.
I feel the same way. I couldn't take a written adventure and just run it as written. I've never been able to do that.
And yet at the same time, not everyone has the time
Sure.
to make an entirely unique world. And it comes back to what I said at the very beginning of, you don't always have to. Take our world and change some things.
Yep.
Again, say that the Romans had guns, or more importantly, say that they had magic.
It'd be a Jim Butcher book called Codex Alera.
Well, there you go. And part of the thing is to change something and then say, what are the consequences of that change?
Yep.
If we could raise the dead, what would the impact of that be? One of the things, I've used that example before, because one of the points to me is, if you had raised dead as it exists in Dungeons and Dragons, one of the key things about it is always it costs a batch of money in diamonds. So the first thing is, if raised dead exists like it does in Dungeons and Dragons, the people who have diamonds are suddenly incredibly important, and the wealthy have access to resurrection when the poor don't.
Sure.
So, already right there, whoever has the diamond mines is an incredibly powerful nation, and you have this severe class imbalance because the rich can resurrect and the poor can't.
That dude with stone shape and fabricate is changing the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The other thing you have to keep in mind is what happens with monarchies and feudalism.
Oh, yeah.
Well, absolutely. And that's one of the things that Eberron has very specific, in Corvair, we've laid out. Once you die, you don't get to hold on to the throne, and specifically undead as well, that undead are considered outside the law. Because otherwise, yes, can the Vampire King just rule forever? And those are the kind of problems that a magical society would have to come up with answers to. So it's fun to think about.
Let me ask you a question about some of the races that you've added. They've changed a bit throughout their evolutions with different versions of D&D. Is there anything you would change lore-wise that you might not be able to due to the mechanics of the situation?
Well, one of the Warforged are, first off, just again, one of my favorite parts of Eberron, and always hard to do, as they change through systems. One of the things I will say is the current version of them in Rising from the Last War, they aren't actually considered constructs, because they started off wanting all player species to be humanoids. Now that they've broken that rule, a lot of the more recent Mordenkainen's things, and specifically in Spelljammer, autognomes are constructs. And so one of the first things I'd say is, make Warforged constructs again. That's just it's just a sort of weird thing to not have done in the first place.
Yeah.
Generally, I'm pretty happy with the translation of changelings and shifters to 5th edition. The tough one is Kalashtar, because their whole idea was originally tied to psionics. They were basically there as part of psionics, has always been part of D&D. We're going to actually give it a place in that world, and part of that place is the Kalashtar. Mm-hmm. And it's not that they don't work without it, but they certainly aren't. That was part of their purpose in the world, and it not being there makes them feel a little emptier. And so that's, the thing I would say is I'd love to see a psionic system or, something.
You're telling us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like literally right over there next to Matt is The Will and the Way from old school Second Dark Sun. Like,
yeah,
that's the one thing I've been begging. Now, Tasha's did a fair job in kind of giving that flavor, but I want psionics.
Like the cyanite is fine as is, right? The soul knife is passable. The lack of primary psionicist is frustrating to me.
I agree. And again, to me, it's just that having been there from the beginning, it was that whole thing of what we tried to do in Eberron was to take all the things that were there and to say, how would this actually affect the world? And then also to take things and sort of maybe use them in ways you hadn't expected. hey, we're going to have our gnomes be terrifying assassins instead of comic relief, and yet also still kind of comic relief. And basically saying psionics aside from Dark Sun. Dark Sun is the setting that said psionics are a thing.
Yeah.
But aside from Dark Sun, it was in first edition D&D, but it was just sort of there as here's a set of rules without a whole lot of sense of why.
Right.
And with Eberron, with Sarlona, the Kalistar, the Dreaming Dark, we said from the start, like, if you want a psionics heavy campaign, here's a whole plot line sort of there for you. And as I was saying before, if you don't, just push the Dreaming Dark aside. Don't worry about it. Focus on the Lords of Dust. You would do fine. So it's trying to make sure that there's a space to play, but not force it on people who just don't want that in their, that peanut butter in their chocolate.
Giving them options.
Mm-hmm.
So this we actually have a question from one of our listeners and a good friend of ours, Mike. He said, "What's your advice for capturing the unique feel of Eberron right from the start of a campaign?"
So there's a couple different things. One of the first things I say is in session 0, I ask, what did you do during the last war? That basically part of Eberron is that it has come out of 100 years of war. And if you were an adventurer, if you were a skilled person, did you fight in the war? If you fought, who did you fight for? If you didn't fight, why didn't you fight? What were you doing instead? You're a fighter. Were you a mercenary? Were you a bouncer? If you are a fighter, where did you develop those skills, and what were you doing with them? Throwing a step on from that is also saying, what did you lose in the war? There's been hundreds of years of war. Surely it's affected you in some way. What did you lose? So those are two things, or just an immediate, I'm not just an elf fighter. What do those skills mean in the world? What did I do with them?
Right.
That's one thing to think about. The other thing is just, again, to start looking at, are there ways to show magic being part of everyday life? Whether it's being on an airship, whether it is talking about the continual flame, lanterns, whether it's dealing with a dragon marked house, working in those things. I will say something I often do. When I used to run Eberron one-shots at conventions, I would often pick stories that specifically just don't work in many other settings. So I told you about that story where they had to find the wizard. And that is an Eberron one-shot that I've run, as I said, 60 times. What I didn't tell you is that the characters are from Droam. They're agents of the Daughters of Sorakel, and they're a werewolf, a gnoll, a doppelganger, a minotaur, and a kobold.
It's Suicide Squad.
Exactly, and a goblin. And that basically it's coming right out and saying, hey, this is Eberron. Things you think of as monsters could actually be the heroes in this story. And it's the Suicide Squad of monsters trying to find an elf wizard who's the bad guy.
Yeah.
And conversely, the other one shot I've run often when I don't want to go that weird, I'm not quite, I don't know, this group wants to dial up to 11, but actually is saying you're a group of Syrian prisoners of war who have, now the war's over, you're out trying to hunt down the commandant who tortured you, the Karnathi commander who tortured you during the time you were in prison, hunting him down in Greywall. So again, another hunt in Greywall. This time you're playing, the dwarf, the elf, the halfling, but you're in a city of monsters and it's their city.
Right.
And you're looking for the human necromancer. But again, when you go into the bar and the bartender's a Medusa, and you've got to be like, right, no, and this is her bar.
Yes.
How do you work around that?
You ask for a stiff drink in a Medusa bar, you might get something crazy.
Exactly. And so, those are, but you could just as easily, another adventure I love to run is Die Hard on an airship. You're on an airship, you're going on a place and it gets hijacked. What the hell are you going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then potentially it crashes at the end, because what's more fun than fighting on an airship? Fighting on a crashing airship. And so those are three examples where, the one thing is saying, I'm going to use monsters in a way you don't expect. Another is prisoners of war. I'm going to talk about the impact of the war on the lives of the characters. Another is something like the airship, of just saying this is a place where magic is part of the world.
That would be it. The Die Hard on an airship would be a great, 2-person game, 1 DM, 1 player. And
Oh yeah, that would be kind of cool.
Well, of course, it's not. I'm Die Hard ought to be one DM, one player.
Sure.
With the adventure I'm talking about, one of the things I like about it is it's an adventure that I can run without a session zero. Because the point of it is the session zero.
Right.
You are the only 5 people on this airship who have the skills to actually deal with this problem. What are you going to do? Like, you don't know each other, but you got to find an answer because none of you want what's going to happen if you don't. And in that particular campaign arc, that's sort of a campaign seed I've used a bunch of times. What happens? Airship gets hijacked. Players have to deal with the hijackers because they're the only ones who can. But at the end of it, the airship crashes, and in crashing, passes through a Lamania manifest zone into Lamania. So it basically goes from Die Hard to becoming Lost, where now you are survivors of a crash in another plane of existence, trying to help, the other survivors and figure out how the heck do you get out of this very hostile environment.
And then it becomes alien, and they stick their overpostures down their throat.
Yeah, and by the time you get through that, now your characters have history.
Right.
Because this is that point of now we're in Stormreach and you can do whatever you want, but you've been through some stuff together. So
Nice.
You have not seen what I have seen.
It's funny, when you talked about one of the ways that you capture the feel of Eberron, making magic every day, my first character for an Eberron game was a goblin artificer who was just a sewer worker for Sharn, right? Because
love it. I played a rat catcher before, so I'm with you.
Yeah, Sharn has a lot going on, and so anybody working in the sewers is gonna need to have some methodologies available.
But he did become a delightful clothing designer as well.
It's true.
What is it?
Smooth of swear.
Yeah.
And this again comes back to the importance of session zero and the importance of asking the players to forge connections. One of again my favorite Sharn campaigns is the Gangs of New York Khalistan campaign, and part of it is we're having this story set in the crappiest, dingiest, crappiest part of Sharn, and the question I have when you're making your character is, why are you here and why are you staying? Like, why don't you leave as soon as you have 5 gold pieces to put together? And, people come up with things like, oh, I was in the Dragon Marked house, but I was thrown out because, my experiments were too unorthodox. So I'm down here because this is where I can do whatever I want. Or, I'm the coming off the war and the city terrifies me, whatever it is.
Sure.
But it's basically saying, this is the movie we're telling. The movie's Gangs of New York. Why is your character cast in it? Why do you belong here?
Gotcha.
That's cool.
Now, we do have another fan question. A friend of mine, I literally spoke to her today, and she kind of fangirled out a little bit about it. But one of the things she wanted to know was, have you ever considered doing a race or subclass based off of all of the moons?
There is a prestige class from the original edition called the Cataclysm Mage. And they, I think, had something to do with the moons. There was also the Moonspeaker Druids. And that's where I would lean towards, is I love the idea of a shifter sort of themed class, like whether it would be a monk or a ranger that would have a connection to the moons and would be able to draw on them specifically in some way. I like shifters because it sort of ties to the sort of lycanthropic connection that shifters have. So I'm all for that. But I haven't actually done anything yet to answer the question, but I think it's a great idea.
Nice.
I mean, one thing I would also say is, actually, it's very interesting. I'm running a campaign right now on my Patreon because I do a Patreon, Keith Baker. And what I do with it is I run a game once a month. It's an ongoing campaign with ongoing characters and an ongoing story, but the players change each time. Every patron can apply to play in the game. And so, as I said, same characters, different players. The current campaign I'm doing is a crossover between Spelljammer and Eberron, where it's basically the space race in Eberron. We're developing spelljamming technology, and one of the characters is a construct we just call the Orrery, where it's the idea of it's a construct sort of designed, a sort of Warforged designed for celestial navigation. And they actually have sort of the models of the moons floating in their body that they change the orientation of to generate effects. And they're a circle of stars druid mechanically, but that's the whole idea, is that they're playing around the moons.
That's cool.
Very cool.
Let's talk a little bit about Twogether Studios, TWO Twogether Studios. And you've got a couple things in the works there. And in addition, you've got a Kickstarter, if I recall.
We do, actually. So we started together about 6 years ago. The first thing we made was the role-playing game Phoenix Dawn Command, which I told you about, the game where death is how you grow stronger. And then we made the card game Illimat with the band The Decemberists. And we have also, is now, we made the Adventure Zone Bureau of Balance most recently, which is a sort of collaborative storytelling game inspired by the Adventure Zone. And it is also through Twogether Studios that I do my work for the DMs Guild, including exploring Eberron. And we have a book coming out soon called Chronicles of Eberron. That's sort of an anthology of different things. But what we are doing right now is to we're doing a Kickstarter for a game called Cool Cool Cool. And Cool 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 is a very casual, fun, fast game. It's a form of slap game, like Slapjack, ESR, things like that, but with fast-paced, silly, you shout a lot of silly words, and there's a certain aspect of shifting rules which helps to keep people on their toes.
Fun.
It's very goofy. It has absolutely nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games, but it is small, fast, and a lot of fun. And so if that sounds interesting to you, please check it out. I believe you're going to have the link in the show notes, so check it out there. Or you can go to twogetherstudios.com, TWO-gether.
Yes, indeed. So we at the Goblin's Corner do a question of the week for every episode.
Mostly just to mess with me. He tries to stump me on something.
Yeah, a lot of times Eric doesn't actually get the question of the week before we start recording. If you were transported to Eberron, what would your house be and why?
Oh, see, for me, that's super easy. It's House Kenneth, because I have the mark of making.
Nice.
So, yeah, which I decided to get long ago, aside from the fact that my friend Lee Moyer designed the dragon marks, so it is the artwork of a friend, but also creation is what I do.
Sure.
So the other option obviously would have been scribing, which I love the Gnomes of Eberron, so that would have been a compelling argument, but we went with creation instead.
Very cool. What about you, Eric?
I mean, I make stuff, so House Kenneth is definitely something that I would probably subscribe to, although I do like House Lorander as well.
I like Lorander. There's a lot to be said for them.
There's only one clear choice for me. That's House Galanda.
Yeah, House Hospitality.
Yeah.
See, and here I thought you were going to say there's only one choice, Tarkanan. Nope. Which is, of course, the aberrant marked house. And well, I also have to say I have a very soft spot for Galanda, the House of Hospitality. And I have played Galanda halflings before, just because to me it's the Bilbo Baggins. It's the character you don't really think ought to be the innkeeper who ends up becoming an adventurer. We had a party once that I loved that was a Galanda rogue who basically owned a tavern, which burnt down in the morning. And then, like, the other characters were the Warforged, who had been their bouncer, the sovereign, speaking of clerics, the sovereign cleric who basically was like the Friar Tuck, who'd been like a rundown barfly and was now like trying to pull themselves together and make a difference.
Oh, cool.
Valinor mercenary who'd worked out of the bar. Like, it was essentially as if Cheers
had burnt
down the bar and said, now we've got to become adventurers.
Very cool.
The halfling looks like Norm. Yeah, kind of waddles in.
Yeah, I'm a former cook, former bartender, former bouncer. Like, hospitality is just kind of where I'm at, so that's definitely for me. Although Aberrant probably would be my second pick.
I mean, that fits all of us, really.
I have a lot of sympathy for Aberrants, so there you are.
Keith, where could interested folks find more information
the simplest place, that's sort of the biggest stuff I do is Twogether Studios, TWO Together. I also write about Eberron at keith-baker.com. And you can find in Twogether Studios, I should note, we're also on Instagram, we're on TikTok, we're all over the place. So, but there I usually post as Twogether Studios. On Twitter, I also specifically post as Hellcow Keith, mainly about Eberron stuff. But basically, Twogether Studios, keithbaker.com, and of course, I'm on Patreon, which, as I said, I'm really enjoying the campaign I've been doing there and the other things I've been doing with that.
Keith Baker is the creator and author of Eberron, co-founder of Twogether Studios. Keith, it was a delight. Thanks so much for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Any questions or comments? Hit us up at Goblin's Corner on Twitter. Did you like our show? We hope so. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player, YouTube or Twitch.
If you could do us a favor and click the 5 stars, give us a review on iTunes or Podchaser. On YouTube, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell. It helps get our show in front of more people, and it feeds the hungry algorithm.
Which is currently a Warforged tromping up, about to hit you with a mallet. That's all the time we have for tonight. Once again, my name is Eric.
And I'm Matt.
And we'll see you next time.
Good night, folks.
The Goblin's Corner is written and produced by Eric Holden and Matt Staples.
The music is by the Mighty D20.
This has been a Subterranean production.